they get turpentine. They manufacture turpentine as part of this whole process, and that also is sold nationally. So, for starters, I'm going to add more to this in a little bit. Gaviotas' sustainable economy comes from the manufacture of photovoltaic panels, turpentine, pine rosin, pine oil. Also, Lugati's speaking fees. He's slowed down a little bit lately, but he used to travel around a lot and give talks and command a speaking fee of about $1,000, and all of his speaking fees went also to the foundation, the nonprofit foundation. In addition to the income, they try very hard to control their costs through common property, simple living, energy, and food self-sufficiency. A lot of the same things are going on here in Fairfield, I know. Gaviotas is doing them too. Plus a very strong work ethic. The only requirement, Lugati told me, to live at Gaviotas is that there has to be work for you to do. He said that they tried in the beginning to make it possible for some people to come and just hang out. For some people to come, I don't want to disparage any musicians in the audience, some people to come and just make music and not do any of the work in the more materially productive areas. But he said that didn't fly. It didn't work out. Everybody has to work, and work is a central value in Gaviotas. He said, we're a community of work. I work all the time. I get tired if I rest. Some of the spacing on my slides got disturbed by one of these transmissions. So that's what I wanted to say about economic sustainability. Let's turn to social sustainability. There are a lot of indicators you remember from that slide, a lot of indicators of social sustainability. But the bottom line is simply that the social system operates in a way that can continue. And this means not alienating people who are in it, not doing things that cause people to leave. One of my main areas of interest has been the history of the Amana community. And one of the big problems that Amana faced, although when they started out, they were sustainable economically, environmentally, and socially, they lost their social sustainability. And beginning around the turn of the 20th century, more and more people from the Amanas decided they were dissatisfied and left. It was especially the young people, and this caused a real crunch in the community in terms of work. So, you can't let that happen. You have to hold on to people. You have to keep them there. I mentioned population continuity and stability. In Gaviotas, there are about 200 people today. There are living in the community, some workers and many friends of the community, as they're semi-formally referred to, live in the vicinity. Population actually has been larger. It was probably as big as 500 or 600 in the 1970s. And then the political troubles began in Colombia, and some people just got too frightened and left, and the population has not recovered, but it hasn't gotten any worse in the last 10 years. According to Paolo, most of the people there have been there for 30 years or more. I didn't have an independent way to confirm this, so I offer that as just a claim that he made. There are no officers and no rules in Gaviotas. It's a very non-hierarchical system. Paolo said, well, it was kind of natural for me to think of him as the leader of the community. He said, no, I'm not the leader. I only have one voice like every other member. And in 40 years, I have never called a meeting. In 40 years, I have never written an internal memo. How does it work? It works by people staying after lunch and talking, staying after dinner and talking. And as he described it to me, there's some issue, people want to talk about it. Somebody comes up with an idea, somebody else has another idea, he jumps in with an idea, somebody else has an idea, and together, collectively, through conversation, they take the steps. They plan things. They plan what to plant. They plan what industries to create and start. They plan what to do with the rosin from the pine trees. They plan what homes to build. It's all done through conversation and consensual decision-making. The only records that they keep, he told me, are economic records, because you have to keep those. You have to be able to figure out how you're doing economically. And furthermore, he stressed they not only have to be honest, but they have to appear to be honest as well. Very important for him. So Gaviotas is more than a village, more than a community. It is an organism governed by conversation. That quote he made right at the beginning of our interview, I said, Alan Weissman considers Gaviotas a village, but isn't it more than a village? Isn't it really a community? And he said it's more than a village and more than a community. Neither of those words is adequate to capture what Gaviotas is. I said, well, if it's not a village or a community, what is it? He said it's an organism. Or if you prefer, it's an ecosystem. So he was thinking outside of traditional categories, and I'm going to come back to that point. I think it's significant. Egalitarianism is a very central value in Gaviotas. Among the earliest settlers there, the earliest people who lived in Gaviotas, there were a number of engineers. There were also some artists, also some musicians, also some teachers, also some farmers. But he said, we are all scientists. Some people have a degree after their name and others don't. Here that doesn't matter. Here what matters is your mind and the creative use of your mind. We all participate in the conversations as equals. I have diplomas on my wall. They don't make any difference at all in Gaviotas. That's not what we're about. At one point I had occasion to ask him about the Guahibo, the local indigenous tribe that lives right around Gaviotas. And he said, why do you single them out? Why should we count them separately? For him, they were simply people. Everybody's the same. Everybody is equal. No distinctions are made. This extends to religion. He said all faiths, including atheists, are welcome here. And in fact, we have a lot of people representing, people represent a lot of different religions here. They had Buddhists, Hindus, Catholics, Mormons, atheists, Jews, Christian Scientists. He said, the more the better. And people ask me, this is a quote, people ask me, what are you? And I say, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Hindu, I'm whatever you want me to be. I said, well, are there religious services at Gaviotas? And he said, anyone who comes here as a spokesperson for a religion, we will put them up free of charge, feed them free of charge for a reasonable period of time, and let them preach their religion. And the room that we were sitting in when he made this comment was the cafeteria. And he said, this is where they can do it. We don't have a religious building of any kind. Gaviotas once operated a boarding school in the first 15, 20 years that the community was in existence. But this too had to go when the political troubles began. A lot of the people who sent their children to Gaviotas to attend the boarding school lived in Bogota or Medellin or Villavicencio, and when the political troubles began, they thought it was too dangerous for their children to stay. So they pulled the children out of school, and that caused the school required them to close the school. Today, the children of all the people who live there receive homeschooling from their parents in the conventional subjects. And then they also do a series of apprenticeships in the various economic units in Gaviotas. Food production or engineering or whatever it is, as a kind of rotation. And they learn a lot of other things through those experiences. The children then, often, not all of them, but many of them leave to get high school education or even college education. Paulo said that many of them return after they finish their education to the community to get involved again. And I see the same kind of thing, elements of that at least, happening here in Fairfield. Another aspect of social sustainability that was apparent to me from the time I spent there was the incorporation of art into the community. Art is everywhere in Gaviotas. This isn't a real sloth. It's a carved wooden sloth. My daughter's standing next to. There are these little carvings all over the place, made by different people. Big mural in the common room, the cafeteria room. And since I mentioned the cafeteria, here were some of the members who served us lunch when we were there. Food and the idea of eating together is another central value in Gaviotas. And here I am. I don't know if you can tell that those are my daughters, but three daughters. My wife took the picture, and Paulo, of course, on the right. Okay, that's what I have to say about the social sustainability. Environmental sustainability. Here's a reminder of the things that we're talking about: source capacities, sink capacities, biodiversity, and ultimately a carbon footprint. Gaviotas generates its own electricity, low-fall hydroelectric generation. It was very significant, I think, for the community's beginning that there were a number of engineers among the earliest settlers, the earliest members, and they really went to work on all kinds of things, including developing a turbine that would generate electricity with a very low fall of water, a fall of about a foot or 18 inches. They developed a special turbine that would allow electric generation from such a low fall. The engineers were thinking outside the box. They came up with all kinds of what we might consider alternative or appropriate technology, and were creating amazing innovations in Gaviotas. And they're still there, many of them, and still doing it. Turned the wheel and lit the electric light bulbs just to prove that it was working. And this was the guy who was explaining it all to us. His Spanish was really fast, and I couldn't understand him at all. Another source of energy comes from African oil palms that the community has planted. This does look a little like industrial agriculture. It's done on a very big scale. They manufacture biodiesel fuel from the African oil palm. I'm sure you know that African oil palm is one of the major crops, non-food crops in the world today, particularly in the tropics. There are a lot of environmental problems associated with it, but at least in Gaviotas, they're putting it to an appropriate kind of use. Their automobiles and tractors are powered entirely by biodiesel fuel that they are manufacturing themselves. Gaviotas also harnesses wind energy. I mentioned the wind during the dry season. And it required a special kind of wind turbine which their engineers developed that could stand up to the very strong winds in the dry season, but still function in the rainy season with much weaker winds. So biodiesel, wind, photovoltaics, energy, and hydroelectric, there we go. They manufacture these wind turbines themselves, low-cost manual equipment. And they also sell the wind turbines, so that's another source of income for the community. So 100% of their energy comes from renewable sources. Water, potable water is a big issue in the Llanos, especially during the dry season. The water table falls pretty significantly. Trying to get to that water in an energetically efficient way had been a real stumbling block, and clean water was a serious health issue. The lack of clean water was a serious health issue. Again, the Gaviotas engineers went to work, designed a special kind of sleeve pump that could pump water from way down in the ground with minimal effort, minimal energy expended. You can work it by hand. I think almost everybody's favorite story about Gaviotas is that the children using teeter-totters operated these pumps to bring the water up. Great use of the high energy level of little kids. The wind turbines have also been used to draw up water. Water has become a central motif in Gaviotas. The lack of water for part of the year, the dramatic lack of water for part of the year, is undoubtedly part of the reason for that. And they have created a water bottling facility. The building itself actually once was a clinic that the community operated, both for its own members and for the neighboring people. But the government shut it down because it didn't comply with certain mandated health requirements and regulations that the Colombian government had. So what they did was convert the clinic into this water bottling plant. And they provide free bottled water to all of the locals, both residents of the community and the people around. And they then sell other bottled water to Bogota, another source of income for them. Among the recipients of the water are the Guahibo, and it has completely eliminated dysentery among them. Dysentery has been a crippling health issue for the Guahibo. The empty water bottles are recycled and turned into walls of houses. They have organic biodynamic gardens, papaya, yucca, banana, pineapple. Neither my wife nor I could remember what he said they were going to plant in these beds, something edible. They raise chickens, they eat eggs, eat the meat. They raise ducks and geese, again, eat the eggs and meat. They have large fish ponds. Here's, when we were visiting, this one was drained for cleaning, and they stock the ponds with fish, and that's a very important part of their diet too. They're currently producing about 60% of the food that they eat. Paulo said that he hopes that they can get up to 80 to 90% of all the food. Biodiversity. Gaviotas has actually enriched the biodiversity of the area, and they've done this in a very unexpected, unplanned, and fascinating way. They planted 8,000 hectares of Caribbean pine. That's a lot of trees. It's enough trees to change the microclimate underneath the pines. And they didn't expect it, but after a few years after they began planting these pine stands, underneath began to develop a whole another ecosystem of native plants that existed in the soil bank but weren't growing because of the exposure to the sun. The biodiversity has consequently, of the Gaviotas area, has consequently increased tremendously. Not only plants, but insects, bird life, other life forms. So their effort, and I forgot to mention that these Caribbean pines don't reproduce themselves in the Llanos. They are an exotic species from the Caribbean area. They grow fine, but they don't reproduce themselves, so they don't have any weedy potential. And in time, those pines will die, and then presumably we will have this native plant ecosystem thriving in the Llanos.
Does it include the native trees or just smaller plants?
No, like this one here, you can see that's a native species. It didn't quite make sense to me. Paulo said that his guess was that that part of the Llanos once was part of the Amazon, Orinoco rainforest, and that things had happened to eliminate it, but the seeds were still in the seed bank. That was his guess. I don't know that a biologist has pronounced on it.
Your birds and other animals will carry seeds in their intestines and drop them. So you can wind up, once you make an environment that the wildlife is comfortable in, you'll get stuff migrating.
You'll get other stuff coming in, absolutely, yeah. Sure, good point. That 8,000 hectares, that's about 20,000 acres. 1 hectare of trees captures about 20 tons of CO2, and that more than offsets the carbon that the Gaviotans release through their daily activities. And this has been scientifically demonstrated. Gaviotas is thus not only carbon neutral, but carbon positive. And that assessment didn't even include all that new growth under the Caribbean pine canopy. So this is how it looks to me. Slide. Same thing happened to this one. On the top line, there should be environmental and a check mark by it, and then a check mark by social sustainability and economic sustainability too. It seems to me that we can say that Gaviotas has achieved the triple bottom line of sustainability. What explains it? Just in the last part of my remarks tonight, I want to offer a hypothesis for your consideration about how we can account for their success in this effort that's only 40 years old. It's not big, only 200 people at this point, but pretty impressive what they have accomplished, and impressive that they are carbon positive. I want to rely on the work of the anthropologist Victor Turner, who described 2 modes of human social interaction. One mode he called structure, and the other mode he called anti-structure. In the structure mode, people relate to one another in terms of rules, roles, statuses, positions within an institution. Structure classifies people. It organizes people. It assigns tasks. It provides consistency and predictability. It gets things done in a conventional way. In structure, the mode of structure, relationships are largely formal, instrumental. People enter into relationships in order to accomplish something, in order to get some task done. At least that's the usual way we think of structure. Relationships are generally contractual in some sense, and they're often, if not nearly always, hierarchical. If you're familiar with the work of Martin Buber, Victor Turner likened this mode of interaction to what Martin Buber labeled as an I-it type of relationship. On the other hand, anti-structure. People set aside their roles in anti-structure, set aside their statuses, and they relate to one another as equals in a mode that Turner also calls communitas. In communitas, he says, people's authentic selves meet and mingle, and relationships are spontaneous and familial. If you think of the relationships within a family, at least within some families, of course, there may be roles and statuses, but there's something more spontaneous, more egalitarian about relationships within a family than there are about relationships, for example, in most businesses. Turner likened this mode of interaction to what Martin Buber called an I-thou kind of relationship. I-it, instrumental, structured, contractual, typically hierarchical. I-thou, more egalitarian, more coming together as equals and as one. Coming away from my visit to Gaviotas, it began to occur to me that an awful lot of what I saw there was similar to Victor Turner's notion of anti-structure. Paulo rejected all kinds of classifications. He rejected the label village. He rejected the label community. He rejected it when I tried to classify the Guahibo as something separate. I got into one little conversation with him. I said, so the people who live at Gaviotas are members? He said, no, they're not members. Foundations don't have members. They're not like communities or clubs. I said, oh, okay, so are they stockholders? He said, no, that word doesn't work either. I said, well, they're employees, right? He said, no, we don't use that word here. And I was getting a little desperate, and I said with a little edge on my voice, I think, well, what do you call the people here? And he laughed. He said, they're Gavioteros, people from Gaviotas. That's all he needed. So he rejected standard classifications. Community clearly is not structured hierarchically, although I was prone to think of Lugari as a leader. He consistently and vigorously debated that label. Talked about their decision-making process through conversation, the egalitarianism in a variety of ways. That shows up also in the built environment. All the homes are equally humble. Lugari lives in a home just like everybody else, which is not always true in intentional communities. The built environment brings people together as equals. There's nothing in Gaviotas that looks like this room. And it never happens that there's a speaker standing in front of an audience with a microphone holding forth for an hour and you're listening. That's not part of the structure of Gaviotas. His use of metaphor also conveyed to me this same sense of anti-structure. It's not a village, it's not a community, it's an organism, or it's an ecosystem. And he continually referred to a Gaviotas way of thinking, which he claimed was distinctive, and in particular, it was different from what he preferred to label as a Cartesian way of thinking. Gaviotas' way of thinking was not linear. It was not analytical in the sense of taking a whole and breaking it down into its parts. If you've ever read Descartes' Discourse on Method, he lays this out very clearly. To gain knowledge, you take a whole, and the whole is too hard to understand, and you break it down into each of its parts, and you analyze each of those parts. Lugari said, no, that's not helpful. We need to look for relationships. We need to look at connections. And that's what he meant by a non-Cartesian way of thinking, a Gaviotas way of thinking. So what does anti-structure do for society, did Victor Turner say? He called it a generative center, capable of reordering models of reality, redefining people's relationship to society, to nature, to culture, capable of initiating and innovating, outside the box thinking. And when I read these things in Victor Turner, it just seemed to me that they applied so well to what I saw in Gaviotas. Reordering models of reality, trying to do things a little differently, redefining people's relationship to nature and society and culture. All kinds of innovation, out-of-the-box thinking. So my suspicion is that somehow there might be a lot of anti-structure at MUM too. On the other hand, Lugari's explanation for what Gaviotas has achieved is simpler. He said all it took was some dreaming. And then he said his famous line, if you aren't dreaming, you must be asleep. Gaviotas is recognized nationally within Columbia and internationally for its innovations. It did make it onto a Columbia postage stamp. My final question at the end of our many hours of conversation, the final question for him was, what happens to Gaviotas when Paolo Lugari is no longer here? I was a little reluctant to put it that way, but he didn't bat an eye. And his answer was, everyone asks that. But we are an organism, collectivity. Gaviotas does not depend on any one person, including me. Gracias por su visita. I'd like to hear any questions, and especially hear your assessment of Paolo Lugari and the efforts of Gaviotas. Thanks a lot.
Even though he doesn't call himself a leader, he would probably agree with the concept of facilitator, don't you think?
He certainly didn't use that word. It's not how he described the procedure. I would certainly agree with you. I'm not sure if he would admit to it. I'm also not entirely sure that he correctly assesses his own role. I wasn't in a position to observe meetings and see how things went. He claims that he is just one voice. He said, I've never called a meeting, I've never written an internal memo. I participate in the conversations. So we can choose to be skeptical of that or take it at his word. Yes?
But you did say you love to talk and you spend hours and hours listening.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that's something not when he's in a meeting, I don't know.
Right, could that be relevant? When he talked about oh, sorry, yes. The lady said, but I said he likes to talk, and maybe that's an indicator that he's more than an ordinary participant in the conversation. I made a kind of similar point. I said, well, it might be that the conversations are open, but in my experience, including experience in intentional communities, there are always people who tend to dominate the conversation. I asked him, or I said that.